What's up, everybody? Mr. Kevin here, coming at you today with some primary and secondary source review material. What we're going to be doing today is going over and reviewing some primary and secondary source material. It's been a little while. We've kind of gotten away from it, so I want to get us back to that. And I think that we can use YouTube as a way to do that. Today, what we're going to be going over explicitly, I start all of my classes with an objective or a goal. So what will you guys be doing today with this video? So in this video, my goal is to make sure you guys know what a primary source is versus a secondary source. So we will build on that in future videos, but for today's purposes, I'm going to model for you kind of analyzing two different sources to illustrate what a primary source is and what a secondary source is. So as you can see, I'm going to point back to my library again. I have plenty primary and secondary sources, more secondary than primary, as most personal libraries probably have, but I do have a handful of primaries. So today we're going to be looking at one secondary source and one primary source with the goal of kind of jogging your guys' memories in how to differentiate between the two. So again, get your eyeball. I'm going to leave that stuff in there. It's just reality. So whenever we look at a primary source versus a secondary source, we always have to start with a topic of study, right? So what is our topic of study? Well, if you know me, you know I like to immediately go to my favorite president of all time, which is Theodore Roosevelt. So what we're going to be doing today is kind of asking a question about Theodore Roosevelt and then taking a look at two different sources and to see if they answer my question. Because once we have our topic of study, we need to ask a question. And the research that we do today is going to help us answer that question. And we're going to use a primary and a secondary source to answer it. So, excuse me. So, our topic of study specifically is going to be the Progressive Era. If you know me, you know my favorite period of American history is the Progressive Era. I think it has a lot of parallels to today, and I think that it's a really interesting time period for American history. And of course, it's the time period that we get Theodore Roosevelt. He was a progressive president. So my question for myself, and what I'm going to be researching, is what makes President Roosevelt a progressive president? Okay, so what actions made him a progressive? Because you can think one thing, but we're not defined by what we think. We're defined by what we do. So what did President Roosevelt do? Theodore Roosevelt, that is. What did he do that made him a progressive? Okay, so that's the question we're going to be looking at and trying to answer. Before we get into any of the background for that, I want to just quickly go over some examples of each. An example of a primary source, or a few examples, and a few examples of a secondary source. So there should be words, somewhere here, that are going to kind of, so you can keep track of which is which. So a primary source includes a document or something that was created at the time of study. These things can include like photographs, diaries, newspapers can be primary sources depending on the question being asked, drawings, things like that. So those are all considered primary sources. There are things that are, or articles or documents that were created at the time of study. And we can talk a little bit about this, but they may not necessarily be created right at the time, but maybe the person that created it was alive during the time. So we'll talk about that in the future. But usually they're items that are created during the time of study as a primary source. Secondary source, you're looking at like most of the things you'll find on a topic, like textbooks, online encyclopedias. I can technically be a secondary source. Things like that, things of that nature are going to be secondary sources. Excuse me, a little stuffing here. Those will be secondary sources. So when we take a look at novels can be secondary sources as well. So what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at a couple of those examples to try to answer our question about Theodore Roosevelt and how he was a progressive president. So to start off with, I'm going to give you guys a basic little rundown of what the progressive era was, so we have some background to work with. So, and I know I'm going quick, but I want to make sure I get this video kind of under 15 minutes or so. So, the progressive era was a period of American history in which the federal government attempted to fix the problems caused by capitalism, and kind of capitalism that had like run rampant, right? There were businesses that were making, a whole bunch of money, and they weren't paying their employees very much. They had their employees working long hours, right? There was no one really to regulate that at the time until the progressive era presidents. So we're looking at things like monopolies, when, trusts. So when several businesses come together and they agree to charge the consumer a really high price for an item, that's called a trust. Excuse me. Food was dirty. Things were getting into the food that was kind of nasty because there were no regulations. Rat bones and fingers and all kinds of nasty stuff getting in there. Corruption, like politics. Politicians were just being bought by the big business owners. So Teddy Roosevelt tried to clear that up. And then lastly, one of the big kind of foundations of progressivism was prohibition and making sure that alcohol was not being consumed because it was deemed immoral. So how did Teddy Roosevelt handle that? Those are the questions that I'm going to be asking, and we're going to try to answer today by looking at two different sources. So again, just to be clear, the question here is, what actions made Theodore Roosevelt a progressive, right? What did he do that was considered progressive as president? So we're going to take a look at two sources. One's a primary and one is a secondary. So I'm going to take this time to explain these examples, and then in the next video, I'm going to do a little reading, and we're going to take a look at a source, and you guys are going to tell me whether it's a primary or secondary source. Okay? So, our first source to answer this question I'm going to use is the selected speeches and writings of Theodore Roosevelt. So these are actual speeches that came from Theodore Roosevelt's very mouth. And they're also essays, so he wrote them as well. They span over basically his entire adult life. But remember, our question is about how did he embody the progressive principles, which is fighting corruption, making sure that the monopolies were broken, stuff like that. So how did he do that? Well, luckily, this particular book has a chapter on page 153, so we'll go there. Page 153, titled, How I Became a Progressive. Wow, would you look at that? How nifty is that? As you'll see, that was written in 1912, so this is kind of nearing the end of the progressive era. But in this essay, he outlines kind of why he became a progressive and some of the things that he did. So that's good. That would be very useful. And this is, guys, a primary source. It was written by Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, in which he explains specifically why he became a progressive. So in here, he kind of just talks about, very briefly, combating social injustice, especially for the workers. He believed workers should have expanded rights and they should be safe in their work environments. So primary source, we can use one of his speeches. That's from the first source. The second source we're going to be looking at is this behemoth of a book by Edmund Morris. It was written or published in 2001, and it's called Theodore Rex. I know for a fact in the prologue of this book, it explains a lot about why Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive and what he did to combat the problems with capitalism. So I can just tell you, just from having read it, that this is what he explains in the prologue. And the prologue occurs in 1901. So this is right when he becomes president. But, so this is considered a secondary source because it was obviously written way after the fact, almost 100 years after the fact, after Theodore Roosevelt's lifetime, and almost 100 years from the progressive era itself. So this is a secondary source. And now sometimes you can tell if it's a secondary source if you go all the way to the back of the book. It should have what's called a bibliography. We should all know about what a bibliography is. And this book's bibliography and all the notes are like 150 pages long. So Edmund Morris did quite a job researching. You can usually go to the bibliography and you will see the primary sources and other secondary sources that the author used. Now I know you can't really see much of that, but point being, it's there and there's a lot of them. So this book is considered a secondary source. It was written after the time about Theodore Roosevelt by another person, secondary. So we've got primary, secondary, written at the time by the president himself, written way after the time by a researcher using primary sources, right? So I hope that you guys kind of got a little bit out of this as a jog your memory type of thing. We're going to be looking at more primary and secondary sources in the future. And what I'd like you guys to do for your assignment with this lesson is to think about in your lives, especially during this point in time, which I can't see you, right? But I want to know what you guys are up to. So if I was to try to do some research about what you guys are up to, what are some primary or secondary sources I could gather or I could look at to inform me of what you guys are up to? Like 10 years from now, if I was like, I wonder what, my 9th graders or my 10th graders were doing during the coronavirus shutdown. What could I look at? What are you guys producing that would be considered a primary or secondary source? So if you guys could do this for me, you do not have to comment this. What I'd like you to do is to take a picture of it, write it down on a piece of paper, take a picture of it and text it to me or email it to me or bring it in. However, this is one of your assignments. Give me one primary source that I could find about you during this time that could inform me of what you're up to. And then one secondary source of something that you guys are producing that could tell me what you guys are up to. Try to remember what primary sources are. Those are things created at the time by the people in the study or area of study versus maybe something created after the period of time or by someone else that has to do with you. So think about those two. It can just be a half sheet. It doesn't have to be like a whole big paragraph or anything like that. All right, and then the last thing I want to do is I want to ask Theodore Roosevelt himself what made him a progressive. So let's do that real quick. Hey, Theodore Roosevelt, come here. Come here, buddy. Come here. Come here, Theodore. All right. Theodore, why did you become a progressive? What did you do? Did you fight capitalism? Huh? Did you fight for workers' rights? Okay. He doesn't know. But I just thought I'd give him a little cameo. Right. Thank you, Theodore. Great job. Okay, go back to sleep now. All right, guys, that's all I've got for you. tried to keep it under 15 minutes. We got close, so keep staying safe, keep staying healthy. I hope you guys are all doing well, and let me know in the comments kind of what you liked about the video. A little bit higher quality if you notice. So thanks, be safe, and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.